Chloe Franken. Okay, wait, this is difficult. Chloe Franken Utitalum. Is it okay? Or is it difficult?
Perfect.
Thank
Perfect.
you so much. Is the president and CEO of Sophie, a business process outsourcing company dedicated to simplifying outsourcing for businesses globally. With a strong background in leadership, customer service, and business development, Chloe has successfully led offshore teams during the implementation of effective strategies and exceptional customer service. Under her leadership, she transformed Sophie from a small business into a multi-million-dollar organization, serving clients across the industries such as travel, technology, education, and retail. Chloe, welcome.
Thank you, Enrico. Thank you for having me. Hello, everybody. So I will share my screen. I'm here to talk about effective management of outsourced teams. So a little bit about myself. Hello, everybody. My name is Chloe. I am Filipina, born and raised in the Philippines, but I grew up with a Dutch stepfather, thus my last name Franken. And I studied abroad in France as well as in Singapore. And I have over 15 years of outsourcing experience working with different nationalities across different industries as well. So we're talking about outsourcing in the Philippine context, and outsourcing, as you know, matters to startups because it provides cost efficiency. Second, you have access to specialized skills. Third, scalability. And as with every startup, your goal is to be maybe the next unicorn. And hopefully with outsourcing, we are able to get you there. So my talk today is about outsourcing in the context of the Philippines. But before I get to that, for those of you who aren't as familiar with outsourcing, I'll just give you a little brief background about outsourcing. So there are four different types of outsourcing. So there's business process outsourcing, which is a little bit more focused on basic tasks such as customer support, human resources, finance tasks, and back office support. So it's a little bit about what Piotr said, that these are basic tasks that can easily be outsourced to a third-party provider. Second would be knowledge process outsourcing, which is a little bit more specialized, that requires a little bit more skill. That can be financial analysis, research. Third is IT outsourcing, which is more on the IT side, software development, infrastructure, or tech support. Someone asked about whether it's easy to outsource development in the Philippines. It's a hit or miss, primarily because, again, the strongest advantage of the Philippines is English, and it's more on customer support. But there are emerging companies in the Philippines that are specializing in IT outsourcing. And last is the project-based outsourcing, where it's a little bit more common with startups because they outsource one-off tasks. It might be a website or a marketing campaign. So when you talk about outsourcing, it's also a difference between working with freelancers and working with agencies. And there are disadvantages and advantages as well. So for freelancers, obviously, it's going to be a lot more affordable because there's no middleman. And it's also a lot flexible because in most outsourcing arrangements with freelancers, there's no contract, which is a good and a bad thing. It's a good thing because it's flexible. You can hire someone and it's fine to let them go. If it doesn't work out, you don't go through a lot of legal hoops. But it's also a disadvantage because they can also easily just leave and go to another client. So there's a good and a bad thing for flexibility. Disadvantages of hiring freelancers: there's a little less control over quality, primarily because you're not there with them. It takes a bit of micromanagement for most. There's also some data risks because in a Philippine setup, most households don't have a dedicated office for working from home. And most of freelancers might probably work in their bedroom or their living room or their dining room, right? Where other family members might be there. So there's some risk of data security being breached. That's a risk that a lot of companies can take, but it also requires some investment in a really good remote infrastructure. And there's also limited scalability for larger projects, primarily because you're working with an individual. So if you're going to scale that project, you're going to have to hire other people yourself. And there's no guarantee that the person that you're working with will be available in the future because they do work with other clients. And there's also a possibility of moonlighting because, working from home, sometimes uh, people might have to work with 3 to 5 clients. So there's that possibility that you might hire someone full time, but at the same time, that person might be working for other clients as well during the same time that you're paying for them. So that's a risk. It doesn't always happen, but it does happen on certain occasions. And there's challenges in power and internet reliability. A while ago when we started, we talked about rain, and in the Philippines, yes, there's a lot of challenges with infrastructure. And if you're going to be working with a freelancer at home, there will be power outages, and there will be internet connection problems. So those are a couple of things that um, is in exchange for the cheaper rates for working with freelancers. You have these challenges that you'd have to face when working with freelancers that are working from home. With agencies, recruitment is more streamlined, primarily because there are more people, there are more support in agencies. So they're able to vet people, do background checks, do a couple of evaluations and interviews. And then there's also a full team available for support. So for most agencies, or what you call BPOs, there's going to be a QA team, a training team, and uh, a leadership team to look after your resources. So there's a lot of support there when you're working with agencies. There's also more structured processes and project management when you're working with an agency. It's also scalable because they have resources to hire more people. And there are redundancies in place in terms of internet and power. So most, if not all, BPOs would have 2 to 3 ISPs in place to ensure that if one ISP is down, there's another that will take over for internet connectivity. And there's also redundancies in power. So if there's a power outage, especially when it rains, we get, flood. We also have typhoons in the Philippines. In most buildings, housing BPOs and startups, tech startups here, we already have generators to power buildings 24/7. So that's already taken care of. Disadvantages, of course, it's going to be a higher cost because there's just a lot more overhead. It's the overhead of the infrastructure, the office, connectivity, as well as the support team. That's factored into the price, although it's still cheaper than working or hiring someone directly in the US or in most part of Central Europe. And for larger BPOs, it might feel a little less personal due to the bigger teams, but it really does depend on the type of BPO that you work with, because some BPOs would be the more traditional BPO where they work with also larger enterprises where there's a lot of hierarchy there. In my case, in our BPO, for example, is a lot flat. So our setup is more friendly to startups because our clients get to interact with our agents directly, and there's not a lot of uh, hoops to go through to speak to your agent. So you can have a direct interaction with your agent. So it really depends on the agency that you work with. And typically with agencies, there are contracts in place. So you'll have to sign a contract to sign on for a longer term. It depends on what you're comfortable with. So these are just some of the quick advantages and disadvantages of working between freelancers and agencies. And aside from working with a freelancer and an agency, you also have to factor in whether it's a work from home setup or an on site setup. So, work from home, as you know, as everybody knows, there's a greater talent because you're not limited to the geographical location, lower cost as well because you're not maintaining an office, and there's flexibility for the worker. So, there's a lot more job satisfaction there and increased productivity with the flexibility. Disadvantages from work from home in the Philippine context: potential communication barriers. As what Roland mentioned a while ago, there are different nuances in culture, and if you're working with someone remotely, you really would need to get to know the person to understand each other. You're speaking in English, yes, but sometimes the meaning isn't what they're actually saying. And I can talk more about that in my later slides. There's also a difficult time to manage with time zones, especially with different countries, and of course security concerns when you're working from home, as I've said earlier. On site, if you're working directly with a freelancer and you decide to uh, go with a seat leasing facility or a co-working space, or rent your own office if you decide to create your own corporation in the Philippines. It's also very much easy for communication and collaboration. There's also better control over the work processes, and you can build a stronger team culture. Disadvantages, of course, higher costs, limited talent because you're limited to the location, and it might not be as flexible or scalable because you're also looking at cost of scaling your office and all the recruitment costs that come with it as well, including marketing. Hybrid, you get the best of both worlds, scalable as well. You're able to build your team culture. And disadvantages, you're still able to uh, pay for an office, to maintain an office, unless you're going with a co-working space or a seat leasing facility that would just allow you to get one seat and then use their meeting rooms. And there's also managing protocols between shifting from working from home and working on site, and the need to have a really good remote work infrastructure so that you can protect your data and things are a little bit more secure, especially for handling sensitive information. So, why is it important to effectively manage remote teams? You're saving on the cost, but if you don't know how to manage your Filipino outsourced team effectively, you're going to run into problems in terms of missed deadlines, miscommunication, and bad quality. So it's very, very important to be able to manage your teams effectively so that you can maximize what you can out of outsourcing. And from my experience, there are six aspects that would really be helpful if you look at them when you're managing an outsourced team. And that's communication, knowledge, collaboration, culture, incentives, and the right fit. The first aspect, which is very, very important, not just in managing Filipino teams, but in general for people who are already working from home all over the world, it's to manage communication effectively. And the key is to be able to communicate regularly, at least once a week. We want to avoid a lot of email and chat overload. Uh, as we work from home, it's tempting to send a lot of emails and a lot of chats. And in Filipino culture, Filipinos want things to be structured and streamlined. So sometimes bombarding someone with a lot of email and chat might confuse them. So there should be a balance with communicating regularly as well as bombarding someone with a lot of information. Being able to set meeting rhythms is helpful. So this can be accounting for the time zone overlap. So being able to give that flexibility in case your outsourced resource can work anytime and can be flexible with their schedule, at least having a set meeting every week or twice a month might be very helpful to just align with goals and look at progress reports, and being able to just sync up regularly at a designated meeting point would be very, very helpful. And it doesn't hurt if you can create a virtual water cooler. When you're working with remote teams, especially in the Philippines, you miss out on a lot of nonverbal communication. You miss out on establishing that relationship, and Filipinos are very heavy on relationships. So being able to establish that form of water cooler online is helpful. It can be a place for people to get to know each other, a place for people to talk about non-work related things, just to have that sense of teamwork and camaraderie online, even if it's not face to face. So that is also very, very helpful. Second, building and maintaining a knowledge base is what Roland also said. Filipinos like to be given rules and regulations. Uh, we we want to be able to follow a set of rules that our bosses would give us, so that there's guidance and we know what to expect. So it's very, very important to invest in the time and energy to create a knowledge base that can have your rules and regulations, being able to create SOPs, process flows that they can follow from point A to B to C, so that they're able to know what they're supposed to do and be able to follow that instruction to a T. Also set clear expectations on paid time off, break hours, and similar items. When I was working as a freelancer over 15 years ago, I worked for an Australian client, and although my hours were set from 9 to 5, it was very unclear on whether I can take paid time off. So I was left wondering whether, if I'm going to take time off, am I going to be paid for that, or how long can I take time off, what are the rules around that? So it's very, very important to set these things so that there's no miscommunication. And with communication, and I speak about communication a lot of times, it's very important to be able to use the usual collaboration tools. So being able to use Google Docs, project management systems to get everybody on track, being able to set deadlines is very helpful. And visual communication tools, again, in terms of communication, it's very important to be detailed, and being able to use visual communication tools such as Loom, recording your screen and showing the steps would be very, very helpful, so that if your Filipino resource doesn't quite understand your instructions, they can go back to the video and review it and look at other things that they might be confused about. So being able to show detailed instructions visually through pictures or through video is very, very helpful. So the most part of it, because this is in the context of working with Philippines and outsourcing, is really understanding the cultural differences. It's important to know the nuances of working with a different culture, and Philippine culture, to be exact, has its own nuances. And it's true, and I agree that you're speaking in English and someone might say something but they mean something else, because Filipinos tend to be indirect with communication, and we also do not know how to say no, and it takes a lot of practice and getting used to foreign culture to be able to say no, because there's such a huge power distance in the Philippines that we really accept hierarchy. So if you're the boss, you're the boss, you're going to be in charge, you're going to tell me what to do. And for us culturally, sometimes we don't know how to say no, because we might see it as disrespecting a boss or a supervisor. So sometimes we'll say yes, but then we're not going to tell you that it might be impossible, or we need more information. So this is something that's really, really important to look at, and perhaps it's helpful to be able to work with an agency first before working directly with a freelancer, so that the agency helps you navigate the relationship aspect of working with a Filipino worker. So Filipino traits: respect for hierarchy, indirect communication as well. We've worked with mostly American clients, and in terms of feedback, it takes a lot of getting used to from other Filipino agents. We call them agents. When feedback is given, sometimes you have to be gentler with your words, because Filipinos are very emotional. So these things are important so that you're able to communicate well with your resource. Next, team building and face-to-face interactions really help. For those hiring remote Filipino workers, it pays to at least meet them once. And if the budget permits, being able to visit your Philippine team once a year is very helpful. Uh, Filipinos are loyal, and if they're able to connect with their clients and that they feel that they're not just an outsourced resource, they're actually part of the team, you get loyalty and you get really hard work in return. And they appreciate, the team building events. So being able to connect with their client is important, and in return, you get a very hardworking and loyal resource for the long term. So Communication and team building, focusing on building relationships is a key way to be successful in outsourcing. Providing incentives is also important. Pay workers fairly and incentivize them to retain quality talent. You're already saving a lot when you're outsourcing, and oftentimes when I work with clients, sometimes they really want to drive the cost down because that's the whole point of outsourcing. And I believe that there should be a balance to it because every year prices go up, and Filipinos should be able to, earn a decent living. And we're lucky enough that there are clients that are fine with a yearly living adjustment. Being able to factor that in really does help. Again, is what I've said when working with freelancers, some of them have to take on 2 to 3 other clients so that they can earn more. And if you're able to take care of that aspect, being able to pay them fairly, then you wouldn't have to worry about sharing your virtual assistant with other clients because they're more than happy. They're compensated well enough that they don't need to take on other clients. So being able to look at a living adjustment is also helpful. So striking a balance so that you don't drive cost really really low is beneficial if you're considering long-term ROI out of outsourcing. There should be a balance, and when I work with other clients, it's good that you come with an understanding and a mutual agreement that you will manage the cost as you move forward in the relationships to be able to make it a win-win situation. Win-win for the company that's managing the contract, and also win-win for the resource that's working because they're able to get incentives, they're able to get a regular appraisal or salary increase that helps them with living expenses, and then in return you get better work. So there should be a balance between saving a lot and then also looking at making sure that we pay fairly. So recruiting, the last part is recruiting the right fit. Not everybody is right for outsourcing or particularly working from home. Home-based workers are often introverts, and sometimes others prefer to have an office-based environment and they need the interaction. So for those who work directly with a freelancer, it might make sense to go with a co-working space so that they can work from home, but at the same time, if they need that social interaction, they can go to a co-working space and meet other people. Next is look for independence and decision-making ability. In the call center setting, especially traditional call centers, BPOs work with enterprises, large enterprises, and most of these BPOs will provide scripts, will provide a standard form of training. Now, for startups, that might not work because most of the time, in my experience with working with startups, sometimes they don't even have a training manual, and they don't even have a standard process of doing things. It's just they go about things, and if they hire a new resource to join the team, they sit side by side or they teach as you go. So sometimes that doesn't work with a typical Filipino resource coming from a larger call center. So if you're looking at working directly or working with a freelancer, it's important to look at independence and decision-making ability so that they don't always look for you for instructions. And with the emergence of more BPOs catering to startups, this has changed a bit because then more agents are familiar with how a startup company works, and they're a little bit more agile and they're a little bit more flexible in terms of thinking on their feet, not relying on a script or not relying on specific instructions and learning as they go. And I see that changing over the years. Lastly, virtual work isn't for everyone. So I would suggest if you're working with a freelancer for the first time, I would suggest hiring 2 people at the same time with the same work and then comparing their work for a short term, and then you're able to then choose the person you want to work with. With agencies, there are also free trial options. For us in particular, when we work with a new client, we can provide 2 agents so that the client can have a choice between the two, and after the trial period they're able to evaluate who's the right fit for the role. So
that's also helpful, being able to test your resource first before jumping right in and investing all of your time and energy training them, only to not work out in the end. So just a quick recap. Effective management requires tweaks. It's not a complete overhaul. After all, management is universal, but in the context of a Filipino setting, you just need to know a little bit of the nuances of working with Filipinos to be able to have a successful outsourcing project. Prioritize communication over communications, and also tools to aid in ensuring that the work gets done properly and accurately. And lastly, cultural awareness, and pay does matter. So being able to know the culture, being able to know what matters to your Filipino resource is also very, very much helpful. And that's it. Thank you very much. I'm open to questions if you have any.
Thank you, Chloe. So I'm a founder. I'm a Dutch startup founder. Like, what is best to do if I have an early stage startup, to hire a VA or to hire an agency?
Well, there are two things. If you want to hire a VA, you have to be prepared as a startup founder to spend time with your VA. If you do not have the time to spend with your VA, you might not get the most out of it, because as with our experience with founders, they need to raise money. They need to meet a lot of people, and if you don't have that time to micromanage, at least for the first part, then you're not going to get the most out of it. So it might make more sense to go with an agency and then have that agency manage that relationship for you, especially if it's your first time. Because if you're working with an agency, then you have team leaders, QA people to get your instructions, relay it to the staff if you don't have the time to do that, and being able to manage that. And if you think in the long run, you already got it down and you don't need the agency for that, then perhaps you can then work directly because you already know how it works. So it really depends on your situation. But if you're going to work directly with someone, you have to be prepared to prepare your standard procedures, have the time to meet up with your resource so that it's effective and it's successful for you.
Hmm. And do you see cultural difference? We talked about culture before, but what are like really challenges from like Dutch startups and Filipino VAs?
There's a difference though, because Europeans and Americans are also quite different.
Oh,
And although there's some similarities there in terms of open feedback and all of that, I find that in working with Americans, they're a little bit more direct, and um, sometimes other Americans who are very much experienced in outsourcing get it. They know how to manage their teams. But for other Americans that, have not done outsourcing before, might have expectations of, oh, I'm sending you the instructions. You should be able to get it and then ask me questions if you don't understand it. And sometimes, again, culture wise, Filipinos won't openly ask a question. So if there's going to be a meeting and you're relaying your instructions and you have a bunch of agents in front of you listening to you, after that meeting you'll say, do you have any questions? Most of the time, no one will raise their hand and ask a question, because they're either too shy or they feel like they might be inconveniencing you. So then they'll ask the question to someone else who might be a little bit more proactive to ask someone to ask the person. So those are the little things that happen quite a lot in the Filipino setting. And like I said, if it really depends on the experience of your outsourced resource as well, because from our own experience, we are a Philippine company and we mostly work with startups. But when we hire people, some of them come from these larger centers. And again, with the larger centers, the people who are training the agents are the Filipinos, not necessarily the Europeans or the Americans. It's the Filipinos training them the Filipino way. So the agents who are probably in outsourcing for 10 years and who are very, very experienced in banking and larger accounts, might have a huge adjustment when they're working with a startup, because then in the startup world, everything is like fast paced, and you kind of have to, maybe training can be done in an hour and you're supposed to do the task right after that. For a Filipino who's been in the call center industry for 10 years, that might be a bit of a shock. But those who adjusted can get it right away. And sometimes from our experience, you might have a better result hiring someone maybe fresh out of college or someone who doesn't have outsourcing experience, because they don't have to unlearn the things that they've learned at a larger center. So different strokes for different folks, especially if it depends on whether you're a startup or you're an established company.
I see. That's clear. Okay. Anyone questions? If not, I would like to know how can we start with outsourcing?
Well, there are different ways. If you want to work with a freelancer, there are websites such as Upwork, such as Best Jobs at PH. I think there are a lot of these online resources where you can hire someone directly. If you would like to go with an agency, we are an agency, so you can send me an email after. And then I think the number one thing is to be able to know your expectations and what are the things that you really want to happen in the outsourcing project, to be able to outline that. If you are working with an agency, being specific with the service levels that you want, being specific with the outlook that you want, so that the agency can then make sure that they evaluate your resource according to what you see is good work. So that, I think that's being able to structure that is very, very important. Even when you're rewarding someone, you can't reward someone based off of, hey, I feel like you should have coffee. No, there should be some basis as to how you reward that person, because we've worked with other companies where we ask them for their feedback, because the type of work might not be quantifiable or might not be black and white. It's very subjective, right? So sometimes as an agency, we can't measure it ourselves. We'd have to ask our client, what do you think of your resource? How is she or he working? And sometimes some clients would say, oh, I from a scale of 1 to 5, I'd give them a 4 because no one's perfect. That does not work, because Filipinos would like, what do I get if I get a 1? What does that entail? A 2, a 3, a 4, and a 5. How do I get there? And it has to be structured so that they can replicate a behavior that you want and they know how to get there. So that's important.
All right. I see a question from Martijn.
Yes, yeah. I had a quick question about the potential visiting. Like you said, that it would be a good idea to at least go meet your well, how would I call it? The people you outsource to once a year. So just from an investment perspective, how long would you recommend the stay to be?
It depends on whether you want your stay to have some vacation time for the beach or just to work. But for the most part, a week is okay. We've had clients visited us for a week, and they're able to really spend time with their agents. If you can spend longer, the better. We've had a client where they, as part of their employee benefits, they send a group of their employees to the Philippines to work for 6 months at a time at our office. So they were able to do that every year as like a perk for their employees, and they're able to work alongside our employees. So it also builds that connection and teamwork, because they don't feel like they're an outsourced resource. They feel like an extension of your company. And for me, from my experience, that really makes a whole lot of difference, because if they feel invested in the company, then they care more about the success of the company. And I think that's very, very important. So it really depends on you. A week is okay. There are others who've tried doing it less than a week, but I think you need some time to recover from the long flight. And you're also not going to be awake for most of it because you're too sleepy trying to adjust to the time zone. So a week is minimum.
Okay, week minimum. Good to know. Thank you.
Yeah.
Jono, you have a question.
Yep. I was wondering how flexible is outsourcing when it comes to scaling up or scaling down when business isn't going as foreseen?
With it depends on your contract. Some contracts are a little bit ironclad. So most agencies would be fine with a monthly term, a quarterly term, 6 months, a year. It depends on what you're comfortable with. There are pros and cons for a longer term contract. Obviously, for a longer term contract, you're able to lock in your agent longer, and then you're able to lock in rates longer as well. But with a shorter term contract, be it monthly, then you're able to be flexible. And if you need to scale down or scale up, then you have a shorter term to do that. But the commitment of the agent is also just the same. They can also opt to work with someone else. There are, for example, for travel companies that we work with, it really is important to be able to communicate the needs of the business. So from the get-go, if you're looking at a seasonal need, then it's best to say, hey, I'll need probably one resource all throughout the year for the basic task, but on certain months, I'll need supplemental workforce. I'll need a couple more people to help with the busy months, and that is fine. So then that's what you call like a project-based arrangement, where you have a resource, maybe one full-time or part-time all throughout the year. And then on certain occasions, if you're a travel company, for example, and it's busy during the summer, you can have 10 more people to help with the workload. So it's important to just outline these peak seasons and low seasons and expectations within the business, so that you're able to plan accordingly and you're not tied to a contract. There are no legal issues and disputes to think about.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. And how often are rates typically discussed and reevaluated?
The contract, you mean?
Yeah, like, is that something that every couple of months that is kind of renegotiated, or is it typical like every month, or like once a contract signed how often would it typically rate change?
So, for example, in our outsourcing agreement, speaking from Sophie, there are agreements where, like I explained a while ago, there's a client that has a yearly living adjustment. So with a yearly living adjustment in the contract, you can bake it in that you agree mutually that every year you can have a 5% increase to account for a salary increase for the resource and to account for living expenses. So that can be an arranged 5% increase every year. Sometimes there are contracts where the rate is locked in for a year or 2 years, and before the contract ends, you can renegotiate as early as 2-3 months to already look at the rates that are going to change upon renewal. You can put in the contract a cap in terms of increases, so that you're not going to run into a contract where you're paying $6 for this resource, and then upon renewal it's going to raise up to 50%. So being able to put a cap in the contract is also helpful, so that at least you're able to manage your budget and expectations upon renewal.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. It's a great explanation.
Got a question about kind of quality insurance, because I know a lot of Dutch startups have a hard time getting into the Philippines and knowing what they're going to get. So how does it work contract-wise whenever it comes to like a trial period, or because it's the same when you hire someone in the Netherlands on contract, you can have a 30-day or even a 2-month trial period of a yearly long contract. How does it go with outsourcing?
So with outsourcing, speaking for our company, so when we work with a particular client and we go through a trial contract, the trial period is free. It's normally from 30 to 60 days. So within that trial period, it's the time for the client as well as the agency to be able to measure performance. So for example, if it's a customer type of arrangement, being able to measure response times, resolution times, and all of those within the 60-day period would be established, so that after the 60-day period, before you sign that contract, you can have a service level agreement to say, I expect my agent to be answering 80% of the phone calls within 20 seconds. And if that is not met, usually in a service level agreement, you will have penalties in place. So you would have to set penalties and agree on a penalty where if you don't meet X number of hours or expectations, then we will need a 5% refund on the invoice or some sort. So a service level agreement would be very, very much beneficial. When we work with startups, most of them don't want to have a service level agreement because they're saying, oh, we don't really think about that. We just want the person to work. But it is to your advantage if you are able to outline these things so that you're also protected as a client. So being able to use the trial period as a period to set expectations, to also evaluate what the agent can do is very, very helpful, so that when you do pay for your arrangement, you already have expectations in place and how you want them managed, how you want your calls or work audited. That will be in place in the contract. So for example, in most call centers or BPOs, there's a quality assurance team that will normally handle audits, whether it's lead generation audits to look at the leads, the contacts that the agent has researched, whether the emails are correct, the position information is correct, or it could be auditing phone calls to make sure that the information on the phone is correct and the agent is not being rude, the agent is helpful on the phone call. So these are things that you can establish during the trial period.
Okay, Jack, I kind of got a follow-up question to that. So I imagine that once you're getting a BPO up and running, you are at a position as a company that you are talking SLAs. However, when looking at a startup, you have 5-6 people employed, and you kind of want to add someone from the Philippines to your team as a remote part of your team. Can you also use, let me just rephrase it, as like a cultural mismatch? Like sometimes there's just no click with a new team member. Is that also a reason to not go through at the end of the trial period?
Yeah, I think that's equally important, because I think for a relationship to work, be it a business relationship, you kind of have to understand each other and be able to work together. So we've definitely encountered clients where it was a mismatch. So when it was a mismatch, that's why normally when we do trial periods, we sometimes provide 1 or 3 resources, because like from the 3 resources, they're working on the same thing throughout the period. The client can then actually pick the person that is the right fit. So from the 3, they're able to pick the right person, and most of the time from the 3, there's one that works out. But normally, not all call centers or BPOs offer that. So it might be something when you talk to an agency, it might be something that you would like to ask to be able to have more than one, so that you can evaluate the performance, because that's definitely very helpful so that you can compare quality.
Is it common to have like an onboarding cultural intermediary in the first 30, 60 days? Or is that something you would have to take care of yourself?
We will take care of it, because there's going to be a team leader. So there's at least someone who hasn't done outsourcing before. So there'll be a team leader who can be the liaison between the client and the agent. Sometimes the client might say something and the agent might not understand it. And then the team lead would have to explain to the agent, not because of language barrier, but it's probably because of context more than anything. And in our case, sometimes I do get in and talk to the client so that I could relay to the team, like, oh, the client wants this. So there are times that that happens. And again, it's also with the structure of either the agency or the resource that you're working with an agency. With larger agencies, sometimes it's hard to get things done sometimes, because there are a lot of decision makers. So if you want something changed, it has to go through this approval and this, and so sometimes it's also helpful to be able to work with a medium size or a smaller type of agency because it's a flatter organization. Decisions get done easily, and it's easier to communicate if you have any struggles or problems with your resource. From my experience, especially with startups.
All right.
Then kind of one final question before I entirely interrupt Eriko's flow. What's the is there also a possibility to start or scale using part-time employees rather than just full-time?
Yes, definitely. If you're looking for part-time work, most likely, like in our setup, we can have people who are already there ready to take on a project. And sometimes some of these people are full-time agents and some of them are part-time agents. In Philippine law, if you're hired as a full-time resource, technically the company can't say you're only going to be working part-time now. It's either the company will endorse you to someone to work part-time and then the company has to pay for your other hours. Oftentimes, if there's no available resource to do part-time work, then most agencies would then look for people externally who would like to work part-time. In our company, we also have universal agents. These are agents who provide backup to accounts where the resource might leave or the resource is on vacation, is out sick. Then there's an agent that is an understudy that goes in and then does the work. So sometimes they're not always working. So these are the resources that can take on part-time work because they're not always 100% working with a client. So that is possible.
All right, check. One final question. Sorry, Enrico. How long until you spin up a team? So let's say I wanna start with four people. How long does it generally take to spin up the team?
Normally from recruitment to evaluations, that's about 2 weeks. It also depends on the skill set that you're looking for. So based on experience, if it's just back office work like data entry or administrative work, 2 weeks is enough. For customer support work where it's very basic, it's also 2 weeks. It's when you ask for specific skills such as SEO, maybe web development or website building or graphic design, that it might take a little longer, but it really depends on the availability of the team that's going to take on the project. So more or less 2 weeks.
And if I wanna, let's say I wanna get 3 or 4 developers with 2 to 4 years of experience
With developers
to join my startup.
Yeah, so with developers, it takes a lot longer because, for example, for us, we don't normally really work on projects that would require web developers because it's harder to get real good developers. From experience, it's either you work with developers directly because they prefer to work from home most of the time, or you would hire a developer that maybe has some experience and you would have to do the training. One experience that we had with a Dutch company, actually, they worked with us on a project. It's a hotel solution, and they started with a team for lead generation. So this is a team of people who were just doing research, lead gen research, looking for contacts. And after a while, they were looking at, maybe we would want them to start doing light coding work on the website. So this is very, very light, like changing the font, changing the color. So one of the members from the onshore team in the Netherlands came here to do a 2-week training with the team, and they were able to at least teach them basic website front-end coding in 2 weeks or so, and they're able to do that more now than the lead generation that they started with. So I would say if you're going to go that route, if it's hard, it's really hard to find good web developers. There are, but I think most of the companies that go with that route, they hire people with some experience and then they train them and then they develop them.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
That was your last question, Tino? Thank you so much. One last question from me. Chloe, if we want to know more about outsourcing, where can we ask the question?
Send me an email sales@sophie-outsourcing.com or chloe@sophie-inc.com.ph. I'd be happy to set up a longer phone call. Ask me any questions. And also for someone who was asking about setting up a company directly in the Philippines, we were also able to do that ourselves. We know the process, and we can guide you through it if you want more information to setting it up yourselves.
Yes, and we are also happy to connect each other, so we will help you.
Awesome. Okay, thank you everyone for joining today. I hope you got more clarity about outsourcing. And yeah, have a good day or evening.